ancient words. Thus Lycophron calls Xerxes Pelorion Andra, or an immense man ; and Sciron he calls Sinnis Anear, or a pernicious man. Alcidamas also, speaking of poetry, says no such a therma or puerile sport is useful to poetry. And speaking of nature, he uses the expression adastalia or improbity. And of a certain person he says, *' That he was exasperated with the untamed anger of his mind." In the third place, diction may become frigid from using epithets which are either long, or unreasonable, or frequent. For in poetry it is becoming to say white milk. But in prose, epithets are partly more unbecoming, and partly, if they are too frequent, they cause prose to appear to be verse. Epithets, however, are sometimes to be used in prose ; for they render the diction more unusual, and cause it to be foreign. But mediocrity must be regarded in the use of them ; since otherwise a greater evil is produced than by speaking casually. For casual diction is not good, but the other is bad. Hence the writings of Alcidamas appear to be frigid ; for he uses epithets, not as seasonings, but as food, since they are so frequent in his writings, so great, and so apparent. Thus for instance, he does not merely say sweat, but moist sweat ; and he does not say that some one went to the Isthmia, or solemn games in honour of Neptune, but to the general assembly of the Isthmian games. Thus too he does not say the laws, but legal institutes, the queen of cities. Nor does he say in running, but with the rapid impulse of the soul ; nor museum, but receiving the museum of nature ; and the sad care of the soul, instead of merely saying care. Nor does he say favour, but the artificer of popular favour. And again he calls an orator the dispensator of the pleasure of his hearers. And he did not hide himself in the branches, but in the branches of the wood. And he did not cover his body, but the shame of his body. And desire the anti*rival of the soul. But this is at the same time a double word, and an epithet, so that it becomes poetical. Thus too, speaking of improbity, he says, the immense excess of improbity. Hence, those who speak poetically produce the ridiculous and the frigid, by their indecorous diction, and also occasion obscurity by their garrulity. For garrulity dissolves perspicuity, when it is introduced to him who knows the subject, by the obscurity which it occasions. Men however use double or compound words, when a thing is anonymous, and the words may be easily joined, such as time wasting. But if this is done frequently, the diction becomes entirely poetical. Hence a double diction, i.e. compound words, are most useful to dithyrambic poets ; for the language of these is sonorous. But ancient names and dialects are more adapted to epic poets. For epic poetry is venerable and superb. And metaphors are most adapted to iambics ; for these, as we have before observed, iambic poets now use. Again, in the fourth place, frigidity is produced in metaphors. For there are indecorous metaphors, some indeed on account of the ridiculous, for comic poets also use metaphors ; but others are indecorous from being too venerable and tragical. Metaphors likewise are obscure, if they are far*fetched, as those of Gorgias, who calls certain things green and sanguineous. And you indeed have shamefully sown, and badly reaped these things. For this is too poetically said. Thus too Alcidamas calls philosophy the bulwark of the laws, and the Odyssey a beautiful mirror of human life. And again he says, " Nothing of this kind introduces puerile sport in poetry." For all these metaphors from the causes already mentioned are unadapted to procure persuasion. But what Gorgias said on a swallow which dropped its excrement as it flew towards him, is the best of tragical metaphors. For he said, This is shameful, O Philomel. For if he said this to the bird, the action was not shameful, but to a virgin it was shameful. His defamation therefore was proper, because he alluded to what the bird had been, and not to what it then was. CHAPTER 4. An image also is a metaphor, for it differs very little from it. For when Homer says of Achilles, He like a lion rushed, it is an image. But when he says, the lion rushed, it is a metaphor. For because both are brave, he calls Achilles metaphorically a lion. An image also is useful in prose, though but rarely, for it is poetical. Images, however, are to be introduced in the same manner as metaphors, for they are metaphors, differing in the way we have already mentioned. But images are for instance such as what Androtion said on Idrieus, that he resembled whelps freed from their chains, for they bite any one that falls in their way, and Idrieus when freed from his bonds was morose. And as Theodamas assimilated Archidamus to Euxenus, who was ignorant of geometry, and this from the analogous. For Euxenus is the geometrical Archidamus. Another instance of similitude is from the 5th book of the Republic of Plato, that those who in battle plunder the bodies of the dead are similar to whelps who bite stones, but do not touch those who throw them. And in the 6th book it is said of the people, that they resemble a strong, but deaf pilot. And in the 10th book, speaking of poetical measures, it is said, that they resemble those who are in the prime of life, but without beauty. For these in the decline of life, and verses when they are dissolved, no longer appear the same. Another instance is that of Pericles on the Samians, that they resembled children who take their food crying. And on the Boeotians, that they resembled flints, for flints are struck against each other, and the Boeotians fight with each other. Another instance is that of Demosthenes on the Athenian people, that they resembled those who are seasick, and that of Democritus, who assimilated rhetoricians to nurses, who swallow the food themselves, and anoint the children with the spittle. And again that of Antisthenes, who assimilated Cephisytidas, who was a thin man, to frankincense, which delights while it consumes. For all these similitudes may be used both as images and as metaphors, so that it is evident that such words as are approved and are used as metaphors will also be images, and likewise that images are metaphors which are in want of argument. It is always, however, necessary that a metaphor should be converted from the analogous, and be referred to the other part, and to things homogeneous. Thus if a cup may from analogy be called the shield of Bacchus, a shield also may appropriately be said to be the cup of Mars. From these things, therefore, an oration is composed. CHAPTER 5. The principle, however, of diction is to speak with propriety, and this consists in 5 things. And the first indeed is in conjunctives, if these are disposed in such a way as their nature requires, viz. So as to be placed in an order prior and posterior to each other. Thus for instance the conjunction indeed, and I indeed, require but, and but he. It must be remembered, however, that conjunctions which correspond to each other should neither be disjoined by a great interval, nor should have so many things interposed between them, that when a conjunction corresponding to a former one is given, the prior conjunction is forgotten. For this is appropriate but in few places. Thus, but I, after the thing was related to me, for Cleon came begging and entreating, went taking them along with me. For here many conjunctions are inserted prior to the conjunction which was to have been assigned. but